Hello and greetings. Just I hear this live stream, but it is a little bit of an overcast afternoon. The sun goes in and out here in Odessa on the shores of the Black Sea. Welcome to Inside Ukraine with me, Connor Klein. This is the second channel I have, which focuses more on the geopolitics of what is happening here with the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this live stream, it will be a mix, as I will give you an update of what it's like here on the ground in Odessa. We're coming towards the end of July in this summer 2026, and I'll also discuss some of the developments in the war. I do plan to make a video about the changes in the Ministry of Defense and the Ukrainian army that have gotten a lot of attention in the international media in the last, 10 days or so, with the replacement of Mikhailo Fedorov as the Minister for Defense, and then Alexander Syrsky being replaced as the Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces after lots of protests and back and forth between the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and different high-level political figures. That has not been completely settled, so there may be some more changes that are to come in the next few days. But later this week, I do plan to make a full video here for this second channel on that topic once we have a little bit more confirmation about what the state of play will be in both the Ministry of Defense and the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Well, we already have a new Commander-in-Chief there. So, I'm here in Odessa. You can see behind me the iconic Odessa Opera House, Austrian designed, and it's a beautiful Sunday afternoon. The weather hasn't been that great in the last 2 weeks here in Ukraine. It's been a little bit changeable, a little bit of rain. And here's some advertisements for some excursions behind me. And I think we're just coming off the peak, the absolute peak of the tourist season here. Last night when I was out, it felt a little less than the previous. The previous week was absolutely packed. It could have just been where I went to as well. But I feel it's just a tiny bit less than it was last week, and that makes sense. Normally the high season here on the seaside in Ukraine is late June, early July, and then it tails away a little bit into July, beginning of August, and by late August it's already coming to the end. Sometimes we get inclement weather actually in the second half of August. Fingers crossed that we get an Indian summer, which also we get in this part of the world quite often. So, because this is the channel that focuses on the geopolitics and update with respect to the developments in the Russo-Ukrainian war, every man and his dog now realizes, thanks to the mainstream media finally catching up, that the trajectory of the war is clearly in Ukraine's favor. We have seen Russia, as I predicted on this channel and on my main channel well over 2 years ago. I said by the end of 2025, second half of 2025, Russia will burn through its Soviet-era stockpiles. Check. They will, I said it was manpower, money, and materials. That's the material. Money. The Russian economy is in dire straits. Yes, they are kicking the can down the road, creating an even bigger problem for themselves. But it's pretty obvious the economy is screwed, and it will take a long time to recover with full restructuring and the end of this war for them to get back on track. They can still do some things in the short to medium term, and really I think it's only short term. I mean, 6 months, I guess medium term is up to 2 years. If we're looking at it in that kind of time scale, or maybe it should be short term up to 2 years. Well, we'll say short term is up to 2 years, and it's definitely only short term that it's going to last. There's no way it can continue on the current trajectory without having a massive implosion at this stage. So they have super high interest rates. They're under a lot of pressure to start dropping them now. Of course, that will just already rapidly increase the already high inflation, high compared to here. I think officially it's like they brought inflation down to, I think, about 7 or 8%. They claim, but it's Russia, so you know it's pretty easy to cook the books there. So I'd be a little bit skeptical about that. The anecdotal evidence is that it's way higher, that they have a real cost of living crisis, not like Americans go on about, yes, things are getting more and more expensive in the US, that's undeniable, or the United Kingdom, Western Europe. But when we look at everyday expenses in the Russian Federation, there are lots of YouTubers who are making these vlogs. Of course, they're pro-Kremlin, and they're showing, look, everything's so cheap in Russia. And, you know, they do have a lot of agricultural industry domestically as well. So they should, in theory, be able to feed themselves. But with these Ukrainian tax on fuel fuel production, and now distribution, and increasingly on the ability of the Russian e-commerce space as well, with the delivery systems like Wildberries. You're seeing that's just going to be passed on throughout the economy. Inflation is basically ready to skyrocket in Russia. But we'll say, best case scenario, the Kremlin's telling the truth, and it's like 7-8%. Still pretty high. If you look at, I just saw the Eurozone inflation figures around 3.0%. So you're talking about like 5 percentage point difference. So you can see, and Western Europeans are complaining. People in Eurozone complain about 3% because normally you aim for about 2% as a central bank. So yeah, it just shows that whilst the overall inflation rate may be just 7, 8, 9%, in reality, it's probably almost certainly way higher on the daily living expenses that are going to affect especially poorer Russians the most. So they're going to be in a lot of trouble. People like pensioners, they're still getting paid their pensions, but it's going to be allowing them to buy less and less. So that's the money part. They're running out of money. They can, of course, keep issuing some sort of debt instrument and push the can down the road for another, maybe, I saw an estimate, 12 to 18 months. They can keep up this folly before they have a real serious economic contraction. We'll find out, because I don't think Vladimir Putin is going to do something strategically wise at this point and actually end the fighting in the next few months. Then we have the manpower issue. Russia now, this year, the first time since 2023, is losing soldiers every month, more soldiers than they're able to recruit. They have set up everything in place to go for another mobilization, which will prove to be extremely unpopular in Russia, judging by what happened in the autumn of 2022 when they did a limited 300,000 personnel conscription and sent them to Ukraine. Who knows how many of them are still fighting there, who didn't get killed or invalided at this point. And there's talk of 500,000, 1 million Russian soldiers being forced, which will be new Russian soldiers being forced to go off and probably meet their maker here on the fields of Ukraine in the south and in the east of the country. So he set everything up. There is now, for the first time since the Kursk counteroffensive by the Russian forces, when Ukraine had in 2024 captured a small part of the Russian Federation, which the only part is actually legally Russian de jure. North Korean troops were used in the liberation of that territory. Now there's talk again. Zelensky has said that they have intel that North Korea is going to send troops. This would make sense because Vladimir Putin wants to put off a mobilization because his number one priority every morning when he wakes up, maybe not always in Moscow, but wherever he wakes up, is to stay in power the next day, right? He is a dictator who has managed to maintain power in Russia for, at this point, over 25 years because it's his main priority. You can't do that successfully in such an environment as Moscow in the Kremlin without being obviously very ruthless, shrewd, and making it your top priority. So winning the war is not Vladimir Putin's top priority. It is, I would assume, priority number 2. So it's in that, but it will always be outdone by his determination to stay in power. And would have been militarily wiser to have gone for big mobilizations back in 2022, way bigger than he did. 2023, 2024, Igor Girkin, the Russian ultranationalist who sits in a prison in the Russian Federation because he's an opponent of Vladimir Putin, not because he's a nice guy. He's a convicted war criminal in absentia, and he fully believes in Russian imperialism. It's because he basically says, maybe without using the word incompetent, but that's what he thinks Vladimir Putin is. And he thinks it's too late at this stage to go for mobilization in order to win this war. Vladimir Putin may still go for it belatedly because he wants to stay in power, right? So he doesn't want to end the war on the line of contact soldiers, then they can recruit every month. That is a very bad development. If we're to believe what Marco Rubio said recently, it's 5 times the casualty figures, or maybe it was KI, I think he said, 5 times higher on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side at the moment when he said it. So that doesn't mean throughout the war, but we've probably gone from something like a 2.5 to 1 casualty figure, 2.5 times more Russians having been killed, missing in action, wounded in action versus Ukrainians. That is now getting bigger and bigger in the sense it's probably going to go north of 3 pretty soon. And if you look at respective sizes of the countries, then we start to look at the ultimate resources that both have, if they were able to mobilize them, then that is a very bad situation for Russia. Then they go into losing more soldiers overall, more people overall, than they have in a proportion that's bigger than the population differences in principle. So all this is terrible for Russia. It is a complete train wreck of an invasion. If you look where they were in 2022, they occupy now maybe an extra 10% of Ukrainian territory, 10 percentage points higher of the country, but it is a huge amount of resources. They're destroying their economy slowly but surely. They're obviously north of 100, I want to say 100,000. They went through that very quickly, but north of 1 million casualties, not KI, but casualties in this war. And the trajectory they're on is, I think if Vladimir Putin actually goes for a mobilization, I think Russian Federation is on track for further decolonization. That means that it's going to get so bad that certain parts of the country are going to, as Moscow becomes weaker and the central control becomes weaker, then they will be able to definitely get a lot more autonomy and probably independence. So we'll see the Russian Federation start to fracture in the medium term, not in the short term, in the medium term. So everything's going pretty badly for Russia. They don't make really any progress at the front. It's something like, I think, on average, half a kilometer a day or something basically immaterial at this point if you add up the territory. And of course, not all territory is the same anyways. And in order for them to have a strategic achievement, they would really need to take the Donbass region. I don't even think most Russians care about it, but at least be able to say he claimed that he managed something with this invasion, other than the land bridge, which has kind of been negated in terms of its value at the moment anyways, because of these medium range strike drones that are making it very hard to actually use the road that's on the Sea of Azov. And the physical bridge, they already had a physical bridge anyways from Crimea to de jure Russia, and that is constantly in danger of being blown up all the time as well. So in order for him to even take Donbass, he would need to probably mobilize 1 million troops and be willing to lose them all, in effect. And it would probably take still 2 to 3 years, even if he were to make that big change. At the current trajectory, without doing it, it's basically never going to happen. It's going too slowly that, maybe in 10 years at the current pace, right, they would be somewhere near taking everything. But the trend is that they make less and less progress all the time. So as they lose more and more soldiers and they're able to recruit, it would eventually go into negative, and Ukraine would, at the current trend, actually start to take back the territory. So they would need to do something dramatic. I think it's a marginal, in my opinion, marginal likelihood that Putin will go for mobilization after they have these staged elections, performative elections in Russia for the Duma, which I think it's the Duma, or maybe it's the local elections, but there's some elections coming up at the end of the season. It really doesn't matter what it's for, because it's not obviously a democracy other than a little bit in terms of being a facade of one with fake elections, whatever. So that is the situation in the war. The mainstream media caught up with it and realized that, Ukraine is not going to lose, something that you would have learned on my main channel, never mind this channel, since I set up 2 years ago, because I got a reminder, I think yesterday, this channel is 2 years old since I actually created it, so I guess I probably didn't even film a video until a few days afterwards. But I said back after, 21 days, I think, or was it 28, I think it was 21 days after the February 22nd, 2022 invasion by Russia, that Ukraine will not lose, and basically Russia will lose. That's basically what my assessment was, and now finally everyone's starting to understand that. And in hindsight, people will look back and say it was clear all the time Russia couldn't win. But not if you were listening to alt media and even the mainstream media in the West, basically plucky Ukraine and can only hold out for so long. Complete terrible analysis, as it turns out. So that is, in grosso modo, what is going on in the war. Still, the trajectory is towards Ukraine at a minimum, not losing, whether we could call things a victory in a horrendous war like this, but that would be liberating all the territory, at least, that is currently occupied by the Russian Federation. That includes Crimea and the parts of Donbass that were already occupied in 2020, prior to 2022. So we have that. As I said, I'll make a longer video about what's been going on in the Ministry of Defense and the head of the army later in the week. Hopefully that we get final resolution. There have been still some protests, peaceful protests, here in the center of Odessa in support of reinstating Fedorov as defense minister. We'll just see where all that goes in the next few days before I make a video. I'll give it a little bit more time. And yeah, that has been a little bit of chaotic over the last 10 days, but I'm pretty impressed by the new Commander-in-Chief's background. So fingers crossed that actually he might even be better. Who knows? But we'll have to see in the fullness of time what he actually does in terms of being in charge of the military. But in general, the whole military industrial complex in Ukraine is growing all the time. They're making so many drones. It's a cutting edge of drone technology. In particular, they've already got these drone interceptors that now take down over 95% of the drones. So the kamikaze drones, even though Russia is evolving in terms of having newer drones that go faster, that have a different sound, that have jet engines. So you can see it's a constant war of evolution, evolving more all the time. But they have that. Now they're working on SAMs that will take down the ballistic missiles. And, they've been depending, as most people are aware, on these Patriot systems. Now Trump has agreed in principle to let them have a license to produce them. That's because the Ukrainians are making an alternative that'll be a lot cheaper. It's just pure economics and business. So they're going to lose their monopoly position on these anti-ballistic SAM missiles, or a very strong market position, if it's not quite a monopoly in the West. And now suddenly they're open to giving Ukraine a license. But you don't think the Biden administration couldn't give them the license 2 years ago to produce them, or increase dramatically more the production? Of course they could, but the people wanted to make money. Unfortunately, this is the grim reality of capitalism and how it's entwined in Western countries, that decision was made earlier, which, if they had already these anti-ballistic SAMs, then Russia's ability to cause havoc will be dramatically reduced. But that is something that will come in the next year. I think that Ukraine will have either ramped up the production of the licensed Patriots, or they will have the alternative already fully tested. And I actually think they're going to roll out the production of the Patriots pretty quickly, because there's an economic incentive for the U.S. owners of those not to incentivize the Ukrainians to focus much on their own version, because that will be a competitor basically. So their economic incentive, as it is correlated with giving those quickly. So that is a way to segue into the situation here on the ground. So yes, we do have not just ballistic missile attacks, but also cruise missile attacks, and lots of drones that attack this city. They occasionally at least fall, whether deliberately or the debris, or by accident they hit civilian infrastructure like residential buildings. One hit in the center here 3 or 4 days ago near to Park Shevchenko, just up the road from here. But by and large, most of the drones are shot down either by the drone interceptors, or like in Ukrainians during the day, they use these old planes basically, and they shoot them down basically, because these, at least the older types of the Shahed drone, are pretty slow, and they can actually fly up beside them and actually shoot them down over the water. So that's all pretty good for people who are here. So it's not as dangerous as it would otherwise be. However, they do need a solution. As I said, it's going to be a while before it's actually effective to deal with these ballistic missiles that Russia fires, because they basically don't have enough interceptors at the current time. Hopefully they get up, just like taking out drones, they're eventually able to take 95%. However, of course, Russia is ramping up production all the time. They're firing more and more of them. So those have to take that into account, that even though the takedown rate is very high, Russia just fires so many projectiles. Again, to tie this back into the Russian economy, just think about how much of their resources they are now spending. Even if they get clever at making them, just their economy is already in a lot of trouble, and they're wasting their money on producing projectiles that have no long-term return on investment. What is the long-term result? They have people working in the short term, building that they pay, they fire it, they blow something up in Ukraine that maybe even in the future they'll have to pay compensation for, so it's definitely going to be loss-making. They don't grab any extra territory and loot it anymore. That really hasn't happened for a long time, because even when they capture territory, they destroy so much of there's hardly anything to loot. So it is absolute economic madness if you just take around the very clear immoral perspective, but just economically, it is borderline retarded what they're doing. But Sun Tzu said, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. So that is what is going on with respect to the Russian Federation. I would expect, now that Ukraine is targeting all these distribution networks in the Russian Federation, they're going to continue in that for the next few weeks and months possibly, and then I think they're eventually going to figure out where these factories are, and they're going to start to figure out ways to destroy them. It seems that the range of these drones by the Ukrainians gets longer and longer, so Russia eventually, if it goes on long enough, they're eventually going to strike stuff in the Far East near the border with North Korea, I think, because they're already going 3,000 or 4,000 kilometers. So it's just a matter of time that they keep extending out. They're hitting everything, and there's no more strategic depth. And if North Korea keeps sending soldiers, who knows where some of that munitions may end up going, or something like Operation Spider may end up being. Okay. I see a client is sending me a message, but it's nothing to do with this live stream. So that is what we can see in the short-term perspective. In everyday life here, everything goes on pretty much normal. We just have curfew, as I've been saying in all my videos on both channels when I'm here in Ukraine. We have curfew in Odessa from midnight to 5 a.m. That means that, unfortunately, the legendary summer nightlife of Odessa Mama on the shores of the Black Sea is quite limited, in the sense that you can't party all night, or you could, but again, you got to be indoors. So you can't party out in on one of the seaside beach clubs until the sunrise, like we used to do before the invasion in 2022. However, there's lots of nightlife going on. It just happens that people go out a little bit earlier, probably around 6-7 p.m. and then they basically all try to leave around 11, when the bars and clubs actually have to be closed and cannot serve anymore. So it is. Some of my friends actually say that they don't like to stay out late, so they actually prefer it, which is kind of funny. Yes, for tragic reasons with this war, but they said they'd rather go to bed around midnight, 12:30, than be out all night. And now everything is so condensed into that time period that people kind of go and let loose. And yeah, basically people are here on holidays, mainly from other parts of Ukraine. There are very, very, very few international tourists here. I would say I saw on Friday night, I went to the trendiest, like legendary cocktail bar here in the center of Odessa, and I did see one other foreigner that I was able to identify as being a foreigner. Just one foreign guy, and he was there with a local who was actually saying that he had just, his friend, they were obviously friends, and he had flown in from somewhere in the States. It was first evening in Odessa, and that was it. Everybody else appeared at least to be a local. I did not hear any other languages other than Ukrainian or Russian. So, and then I'm thinking last night, I also did not come across anyone who was a foreigner at all. I was in the Arcadia part of the city. It's not really my favorite, but there's a light life there. And yeah, absolutely no one. Everyone spoke to me in either Ukrainian or in Russian, and I didn't hear any other languages. So there's almost no international tourism. That is the reality on the ground. There is significant internal domestic tourism because this is the only city on the seaside basically that is under Ukrainian control. So basically people want to have a seaside holiday, they got to come to Odessa. There's no other option. And for men between the ages of 23 to 60, they need permission to leave Ukraine. I was talking to one of my friends last night he's a foreign citizen. So he doesn't have that problem leaving. And, he was talking about just how unfair it is, especially because he knows some people are Russians who managed to get visas to visit Europe this summer. And so how can someone from Moscow be able to get a visa and leave who's a guy who's like 35 years of age when a guy from Kyiv can't do the same so easy? I said, yeah, it's one of these perverse things in the war and something that hopefully will be corrected. And finally, they'll stop issuing these tourist visas to Russians to come and enjoy Western Europe when they're their government is effectively trying to crush not just Ukraine, but eventually try to dominate the entire continent. That is the goal, which will clearly fail because they're not going to win here in Ukraine. So that is what you see. Just a lot of guys that can't leave or they're on a break from the military, so they come and let loose in Odessa. So it's pretty intense. If you come here as a foreigner, your card should work. There are money changes everywhere. Internet and your phone. Most of my American clients, they already have an international plan that they activate. So the data will work on your phone when you come here as roaming as part of that package, or you just get an eSIM the first day, and then it costs you like $7 or $8, 6-7 euros per month, and you have basically as much data as you'd ever need on your phone while you're here for a month as an eSIM, so you don't even have to stick in a new SIM card. What else? The internet here in the city, it works nearly all the time. It's very rare that there's any electricity out. I did have one day during the day where my water wasn't working and electricity was out, but I think that was just some scheduled maintenance in my building that I was unaware of. But other than that, no, there's no other real inconvenience. All the cafes, restaurants, very few of them that I used to go to before the war actually closed. So it's basically just with new places open. I see that there is a question there. I'll come to it in a second. Something about Kherson and Kharkiv. And yeah, life goes on. People are enjoying it. It's just, I guess, if you have been here to Odessa before the invasion, I would say obviously the difference is that you have air alerts, of course, going off. You will hear air defense, and you may hear explosions, and hopefully you're not in the wrong place at the wrong time and actually get injured or worse by Russian terrorism when you're here. But the risk would be 1 in a million per day, roughly. You can go to the AIs, whichever is your preference, and put it in, what is the risk of being injured or killed by Russian attacks in a city like Odessa or Kyiv, wherever you think you're going. And you'll see that, at least when I put it in, maybe about a month or two ago, that was the actual risk. So it's not actually statistically high per day. Obviously, if you spent the entire war here, that's 1,000 days, and you'd have to multiply by 1,000. But if you're coming for a 10-day trip or even 3 months, it's not massive, the risk of actually being here. Of course, touch wood on not being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Personally, for myself, it is what it is. So that is the risk level in being here. And otherwise, outside of curfew being inconvenient, and obviously traveling here being inconvenient, you cannot fly into Ukraine. There are no commercial flights yet. There has been talk for many years that they're going to figure out some way to have some flights into the country. I think without putting foreign planes there and just making it really hard for really a huge deterrence for Russia to try and shoot down a commercial airplane. I don't see why we're even talking about it, but at the moment you need to fly into a neighboring country. So if you wanted to come here to Odessa, the best way is to fly to Chisinau, Moldova, then take a bus from the airport. It takes 4 to 5 hours from the airport of Chisinau to get here to Odessa. There's just 20, 30, 40 buses per day. There's just a lot of buses going at all time of the night, everything. So it's not a big deal. You can buy the tickets online and you just get it from the airport. If you want to go to Kyiv, you could actually come here first via Chisinau and then head up. Just travel up, it's 5 or 6 hours by car or by bus to the capital from here after you arrive. Or you could go from Warsaw, first through Lviv in the west, all the way across. That's probably a longer trip actually overland, because it takes about 10 hours to get from Warsaw to Lviv to start with, and then you got to get another 6-7 hours probably from Lviv to Kyiv. If you want to go to the west of Ukraine, Lviv is also in the west, and the danger level, the threat level is lower than here, but even lower is if you go to Uzhhorod or you go to Chernovtsi, which are really the gateway cities. If you want to have basically almost no risk whatsoever, you could go to those cities, and then you would fly into northern Romania, say like Suceava is very close to Chernovtsi, or you could go to Budapest even. It's not that far. You can take a train to Mokechevo and then on to Uzhhorod, or you can fly to Kosice in eastern Slovakia, and it's pretty close also to Uzhhorod. So, and if you go to eastern Poland, obviously you'd be even closer to Lviv. They're the main ways that people go in. Some of my clients are interested in buying property further to the east, so because the price of property has gone down quite a lot in cities like Kharkiv. Someone wrote Kherson, but obviously Kherson, because it's so close to the river Dnipro and is attacked so regularly that it's obviously the price has gone down there a lot, because it's not really inhabitable at the moment. So cities like Mykolaiv, it's gone down. So anywhere close to the front, the price of property has gone down. Some people who are more speculative and more risk-taking, they see opportunities there, and they are interested in going to those cities. You will not be able to go to a city that is super close to the front line like Kherson without permission from the Ukrainian military, because it is too dangerous. So that is the overall situation. People's spirits, people have adopted this wartime situation. It's obviously not ideal, and I can't give you realistically a full spectrum of the public sentiment here in Ukraine, because I only speak to a small part of society, and it is what it is. You can see that even with martial law, people have protested, for example, the removal of Mikhailo Fedorov as Minister for Defense. So there is, in spite of it actually not technically been legal to organize those protests, there is a certain amount of laissez-faire from the authorities with respect to that. And actually, with the sun, it's gotten pretty hot behind me. I guess it was hitting right on the back of my neck here, so I've actually sweated up a little bit, which was not the case when I started this live stream. So overall, that is the situation on the ground. Price-wise, it's probably the cheapest place in Europe at the moment to come to. It definitely will break the bank in that sense here. And it is significantly cheaper than going to Poland, maybe compared to going to Warsaw. Here it's about half the price probably. And it's considerably cheaper than going to even neighboring Chisinau in Moldova. My flat white index, it's about €2.10 for my flat white, was in Chisinau it's €3.30, and in Warsaw, even though I've had way less inflation this year, it's still like €4.20, €4.30 in general, even up to €4.80 there. So you can see the price difference. That's still cheaper than being in Western Europe and North America. I would say it'd be about €5 is comparable for my flat white in a similar kind of city in Western Europe nowadays. And if you go to the Côte d'Azur and you large it up, well, then you spend easily 10 times the price of coming here to a place like Odessa during the summer. So I think what media gets wrong, because media needs clicks in order to finance itself, they're either going to tell you everything is destroyed, or they're going to tell you there's no war going on, depending on their political perspective and editorial line. And of course, the nuanced reality is that it's somewhere in between. People have adapted to the situation, and normal life goes on as normal as possible. So even though we have attacks almost on a daily basis here in Odessa, people go out, they party, they have fun in spite of everything, and in general the mood is pretty upbeat, at least when I go out and socialize here in Odessa. So I will leave it at that. That is your update here in July 2026. We come to the end of it. And I am really surprised at how much I've actually sweated during this live. So let's see if I can read. Okay, so someone's asking if they come to this region, basically, I think you said Kharkiv and Kherson, which language should you speak? So the situation in the east and the south of Ukraine is currently, from my perspective, it is effectively bilingual with Ukrainian and Russian spoken. The only official language in Ukraine is Ukrainian. The reality on the ground is that most people here in Odessa, in everyday conversations with each other, informally speak in Russian. In the more formal setting, then people speak in Ukrainian. I don't think it really matters too much in this part of Ukraine, which you speak in as a foreigner, especially if you don't speak Ukrainian, and maybe the other person doesn't speak English, then no one's going to make a big deal if you use Russian as a lingua franca. If you are in Kyiv, it's less and less Russian is less and less spoken there compared to, say, a decade ago. Well, it's actually the same situation here, is less and less spoken, but there definitely Ukrainian is the dominant language. I wouldn't really say it's bilingual. I would say it is Ukrainian speaking nowadays in the large majority. Of course, some people speak Russian. It's not illegal to speak in Russian here in Ukraine, despite whatever rubbish Russian propaganda claims. And then if you go to, say, like Lviv, well, then not that many people, especially younger people, actually speak any Russian nowadays, unless they happen to probably migrated from another part of Ukraine. Maybe an internally displaced person might, having come from further east. But yeah, there everything is more or less in Ukrainian. Russian is not really going to be much help to you in a place like Lviv. Plus the level of English is a bit higher there as well. So you probably end up speaking in English if you don't speak Ukrainian. So that's what I'll say about that. So if you go to Kherson and Kharkiv, you could speak in either. I don't think it is so important nowadays. I actually speak, just to give you my own experience, I speak when I go to the cafes, restaurants, basically only in Ukrainian, because I also want to improve my Ukrainian. The best way to improve a language is to speak as much as possible. And then in a lot of informal conversations, maybe someone started speaking to me in Russian, so I just continue Russian. Last night I spoke to a couple guys that were on holidays from Western Ukraine, so we spoke only in Ukrainian. And then, yeah, there were some girls who were a friend of mine who were there, who are local, and they just started asking me questions in Russian, so I replied in Russian. So that's kind of the way it is here. I guess if you speak both languages, you're pretty good to go. Not that too many if you are already fluent in both Russian and Ukrainian, unless you're from here. Let's see. I always have to, I forgot my phone is in another language, so I can, for some reason, it doesn't show me your questions in English. At the Seite Angriffe und Raketen in Odessa und was das genommen. So I think you're asking me if there are more attacks. And I would say yes, but then warum kind of rising Kazakhstan? Okay, someone's asking me why. I think you're asking me why you haven't traveled to Kazakhstan. So, yes, as I said, there have been more attacks than, say, a month ago. I was at the Black Sea Security Forum. That was at the end of May. And there were some attacks right after that. And then there was like a lull of about a month where there weren't so many attacks here in Odessa. And now in the last month, yeah, there's definitely been way more than the previous month. So it goes up and down. We don't know what the future holds in terms of the regularity. Russia seems had built up a surplus of munitions, and because Ukraine may soon get these SAM, so surface area missile, anti-ballistic missiles, that would mean that ballistic missiles that Russia has in stock, if they weren't to fire them now, and then the Ukrainians successfully introduce a capability to take them down pretty successfully, or they get more interceptors in the future, then they wouldn't be as useful, because say they fire 100 now and Ukraine takes down about 30. Well, if they have an effective system in place, say in 6 months, then maybe they'll be taking down 80 or 90% of those ballistic missiles. So there you can see they'd be wasting about 50% of them. So that's why I suspect they're firing a lot now. They've also converted a lot of these S-400s, and they're also firing them as well, even though they are initially supposed to be actually air defense. Well, that probably is an indication why Russian air defense is so crappy, protecting Russia in general at the moment. So yeah, they seem to be leaning heavily and firing as much as possible now. What will that mean, presuming that Putin doesn't just stop the fighting and he goes on, as looks increasingly likely, into 2027? Well, Ukraine's going to have a lot more and better air defense to cope with those threats. And Russia's already burning through probably a bit of its inventory. They're actually firing more rockets now than they produce, at least that's what the Ukrainians think. So they're probably just burning through a lot of their inventory now, in the expectation that, I'm just deducting this, right, using a little bit of common sense, that if Ukrainians are saying that they're going to get more air defense to deal with ballistic missiles, then the logical thing to do from Russian point of view, as terrible as it is, to fire them now before the Ukrainians have the interceptors. So I think that's why we've seen it. But it's not clear to me for how much longer Russia could continue to burn through them. What is in their inventory? Probably another couple of months like this, and then they would just not have the excess, and they'd actually be in a pretty vulnerable position. The other question was, why hasn't I gone to Kazakhstan? I actually I answered a client this morning because he wanted to go in September, but I don't think that's going to be a convenient time. We'll just have to see what happens. But at the moment, I still haven't any confirmed plans to go back to Kazakhstan. If you're someone who's interested, then I guess you should apply for my in-person experience if you want to come. For me, that is not down below in the description of this live stream, because you'll have to go over to my website to find that, which is connorklein.com. But you'll see down below the link to my consulting already. I put it in the description, and there you can click through to read about the New Europe experience. And there are some, these are midges, or probably midges that are now circling me as I sweat here under the sun in Odessa, Mama. Any other questions or comments? I give you an overview of what it's like on the ground in Odessa, end of July 2026. It's pretty hot. The weather forecast is pretty awesome for at least the next week. From tomorrow onwards, we're not even going to have these clouds anymore. So your Irish boy, as white as I am, because I don't really like to hang out on the beach with the skin, I try to protect it as much as possible. I will probably be getting a little bit more than the farmer's tan that I have at the moment in the next week. I plan to be here in Odessa and to enjoy the seaside scene, maybe even record a little bit of it for the video that will come out at the end of the summer on the main channel, on the lifestyle channel, which is Connor Klein New York Experience. These midges are everywhere now. So this is the first live stream I've done or shot a video where I've really gotten a lot of midges coming over. So I'm not sure what it is, if it's something that's happened in the last few days or not. But that video will be coming out probably by the end of September. The last scene, the last place I want to film to put into it, I plan to do so during the first week of September, which is actually my birthday. I'm going to go somewhere for a particular event. And probably after that, I just close out the filming. I have only one clip that I need to film here, actually in Odessa, and I've been meaning to do for 10 days. So I have it on the schedule to do tomorrow with the beautiful sunshine. And then I actually don't really need to film here in Odessa for that video anymore. And it will be coming out. It'll give you at least an idea what it was like here. Wie bucht man am besten ein Zugticket? Okay, so you were asking about train tickets to Kyiv. Now, I don't actually recommend taking the train to Kyiv. I guess you mean from Warsaw, if you mean to get to Kyiv. From Warsaw, I always take the bus because I don't want to spend all night on an overnight train. I hate overnight trains. Some of my clients have taken it, and I just never sleep on these overnight trains. So I just would rather go to Lviv in one day, sacrifice the 10 hours to get there by bus, and then sleep overnight, enjoy lovely Lviv the next morning, and then continue on, whether it's to Kyiv or to come down here to Odessa, Mama, on the shores of the Black Sea. So if you wanted to book your train ticket, there has been a lot of problems with availability. You can obviously look at the Ukrainian website for trains, or you can look at the Polish website. I haven't personally booked that ticket. I know in the past people booked them and then they were just they were reselling them at a profit and changing the names and all this kind of shenanigans going on. I think that's less happening nowadays, and basically you just go and you buy it either in person at a kiosk in Warsaw if you can't buy it online. But just it's like getting a train ticket anywhere else in the world. You buy it online, and if it's not available online, you buy it in person. That's what I recommend to do. If you really want to take the train and go all the way to Kyiv from Warsaw, I would actually recommend not doing that and just taking the bus to Lviv and then taking another bus onwards. Even though I don't like buses in general, I would normally take a train. Just don't like night trains. That's a big exception. And basically that's what you got to do to take the train from Warsaw to Kyiv. And with this war, yeah, the trains are not as convenient. And also for connectivity on your phone with the Wi-Fi, it's not as good if you take the train always, because the train lines are not as covered as well as the main roads. The main roads, they're always got coverage on them. So yeah, I can just watch videos nonstop. It tires me out looking at the screen, of course, but it's a sacrifice. I mean, I basically can work on the bus without really too much problem, because with the nature of this channel and consulting, I can do it all basically from my phone, except for maybe looking at, some things to do with video editing if I need to do that. But yeah, in general, I recommend taking the bus because you get better connectivity. It's going to be less tiring than taking the train. And, if you're going to Kyiv, then you can always stop off in lovely Lviv, which is a beautiful city in the west of Ukraine that I really recommend going to. So that's what I will say with respect to travel to Ukraine. You just need your passport. I've said in these videos, you need 3 months minimum validity on your passport. That's assuming you have visa free to Ukraine, which is, it's going to be countries like the UK and EU passport, Switzerland, the Antipodes, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Mexico, I'm pretty sure. Like most countries where my viewers are watching from, you have 90 days, every 180 visa free. Technically, because I know you need 3 months for Moldova, but actually in Ukraine, you need to have enough validity for the purpose of your trips. Now, your visa free at most when you cross the border is 90 days. That's why I say 3 months. So, I mean, I guess they would, if you only had 2 months left validity on your passport and the Ukraine say, hey, how long are you staying? You said 10 days. You'd probably be fine, but to be sure, 3 months validity. I think it's, only in an emergency should you be doing that. And I don't know what that emergency is realistically coming to Ukraine with respect to the validity on your passport. Otherwise, that's all you need. You're not obliged to have any additional insurance. In reality, maybe that's one interpretation law, but I've never seen anyone stop for not having it. You may want to take it. That's up to you if you want to take additional insurance to cover you when you're here in Ukraine, because obviously is a country where there is a war going on. So I think everyone understands the reasons for that. One anecdote I'll tell you is that I actually had